Hello everyone, welcome to Informatica Support Videos. I'm Bhavna from the Global Customer Support MDM team. Hope you're all doing well. Today we'll discuss about the MDM CustomLoginConfig App 3, which is the version 3. So let's get started. Here is the overview of what we're going to discuss today. We'll start with a brief introduction about the MDM CustomLoginConfig app. Then we'll discuss about its compatibility with MDM, followed by some of its features. And then we'll discuss its installation steps, followed by a demo, after which you'll have a good look and feel of this new version. The MDM CustomLoginConfig app works as a plug and play between the MDM and SAML. We can use this utility and make a couple of configurations to implement single sign-on. So this eliminates the need to write any Java custom code on our end to implement single sign-on. This utility comes with a user interface to create, update, and roll back single sign-on configuration. Back in version 2, we used to do it via a JSON at the backend. But then since we have added a lot of additional parameters in V3, it's kind of difficult to do it via the JSON. So we have introduced this user interface for the ease of usage. One of its most important enhancements is also the support of multiple user interfaces. For example, if we have a requirement where we need to implement single sign-on for Entity 360 and Customer C360 or Supplier C360, we can very well do it with this new updated version. It also supports search-based LDAP, which we'll talk more about in another support video. So let's continue. Let's look at the compatibility of this version with our MDM versions. So it's supported on all the MDM versions and across all the app servers, the JBoss, WebLogic, and WebSphere. And also it supports E360, C360, S360, and MDM apps, all these user interfaces, and MDM apps is specifically for the 10.4 versions. Here are some of its features. So as we have discussed, we have a UI now to configure single sign-on. So all we have to do is hit this URL. So the MDM CustomLoginConfig App / just give your IP and port and hit this URL, and you'll have access to the UI to configure single sign-on and also to update or roll back the configuration. As we have discussed before, we support this utility to configure single sign-on on all of these applications: Entity 360, Customer C360, Supplier 360, MDM apps, and combinations of these. We also support URL encoding of SAML response and SAML request. So if your single sign-on team wants SAML response URL to be encoded, then we can enable it and just URL decode it. We also support encryption of security payload. This is also an enhancement. It's nothing visible to the end user, but basically we prepare a custom payload in the backend, which was never exposed. We never used to encrypt it, but now we encrypt it for enhanced security. We also have encryption support of SAML response in this version. So if your single sign-on team wants your SAML response to be encrypted, then we can enable it. One more addition is the post request support of SAML response. Previously, we used to just do the redirect, but now we support post as well for this version. One important addition is also enhanced logging mechanism. This is specifically important because of a bug in JBoss for MDM 10.4 HF2 onwards, due to which we cannot print any of the log messages corresponding to this application in the JBoss server log. So we'll print it in a separate log, which will be in the same folder, like the standalone logs folder, and the log is called the MDM CustomLoginConfig App.log. But for all the other application servers, the logs will be printed in the same system out log only. Let's move on. So the installation steps are pretty easy. So this utility comes with two components. So one is the MDM CustomLoginConfig App V3 that we need to deploy in the same application server as MDM. So the next thing is to place the SAML folder, which comes with the build, in the hub server support folder, and then we should be good to get started with the configuration. Let's move on to the demo. Let me walk you through the installation steps. As I mentioned before, the installation consists of two parts. So the first one is to deploy the WAR file in the JBoss standalone deployments folder. You can see the MDM CustomLoginConfig App V3 that is deployed here. So for JBoss, you can directly just copy paste the WAR and it gets deployed. But for other application servers, you have to manually deploy this WAR file. Now the second step in this installation is copying the SAML SSO folder onto the hub server support location. So if you see, there's a SAML SSO folder here, and then there's all these folders within it, which we'll discuss later. So let's move on and have a quick look at the UI now. So let me copy paste that UI. As I showed you in the previous slides, this is the UI URL that we need to hit to access the UI, and we'll be taken to the login page. Here we will be putting in the MDM admin username and password. So once we put in the username and password, the internal server URL is the IP and the port that you use to log in into the hub console. So you can put that in and go ahead and log in. So once you log in, this is how the UI looks like. There is two different sections for the search-based LDAP and single sign-on. So we'll kind of skip the search-based LDAP for now because we'll be covering that in another support video. So let's take a look at the right-hand side parameters here, which are basically the common components or the parameters for both search-based LDAP and single sign-on. So the first parameter is skip external authentication for admin. So if you want to skip the authentication of an admin user, you can go ahead and enable this parameter. The second one is skip validation of LDAP or the SSO server. So if you want to check the connectivity of the LDAP server or the SSO server, that's when you have to use this. But if you want to skip it, you can skip it, but it's advisable to use it because if there's any connectivity issue, we can avoid that kind of scenario. I'm skipping it for now. The next one is the application server type. You can select based on whatever application server you are using. For me, it's JBoss. And the next one is the database. So for me, it's SQL Server. Like I mentioned before, like we support all the combinations of application servers and databases. So we can keep that in mind and we can just choose whatever we are using. Let's take a look at the single sign-on parameters now. So the first one is the bad credentials URL. So this is basically the redirect page if the credentials given by the single sign-on provider are wrong. So you can put in any URL here that you wish so that you're redirected to that page whenever there is some wrong credential provided by SSO. The next URL here is the logout URL. This is the redirect page when the user presses the logout button on C360, 360 or any other application where we have configured SSO. So based on your requirement, you can give any of the URLs here, whatever you wish. And for now, I'll just go ahead and choose google.com. Now the next parameter we have here is the SAML response type. We have two components within this, which is the subject and the SAM account ID. So if the SAML response type is subject, then we find the username in the subject or name ID, else it can be SAM account ID, and then we would search for SAM account ID in the SAML response. The next parameter is check whether the user is present in MDM. This is like a check on the MDM database side before allowing the user to log in. We'll just go and check if the user is present in the database, allow the user to log in. If we need that kind of functionality, we can enable this. Now, in a case where the user is not present in MDM, it will have 0 roles, and then it will just show a blank page to us instead of redirecting to the bad credential URL. The next parameter we have here is the validate signature in SAML response. Now, if we want to check the signature in the SAML response, that is if the SAML response is signed and then we need to do signature verification, then we need to enable this parameter. Okay, let's move ahead. The next parameter is SAML response is URL encoded. If there is a requirement from the SSO team that the URL needs to be encoded, in that case, we'll go ahead and enable this. And by enabling this, we're basically just converting like the non-conforming characters like blank spaces and all of those characters into like a ASCII code, like hexadecimal digits. The next one is convert to username from email ID. So if we get an email ID from SAML, in those cases, if we want to change it to a username by getting rid of @companyname.com, then we can use this parameter. Let me go ahead and enable the convert to username from email ID parameter. The next one is response is encrypted. So if you want your SAML response to be encrypted, then you can go ahead and enable this parameter. So this is again decided by your SSO team. Now, once you enable this, you will be prompted to fill in these values. So you have to give the location of the private key. So either you can choose it from your local and put in the location there, or you upload it from any location where you have put it. And then there's also the encrypted response parameter name. It's usually SAML response. But then some of the SSO providers change their SAML response to some other name, like it can be encrypt, like ENC SAML response or something around that. So this is optional though, so you can fill it up depending on what information you get from the SSO team. Moving on, so the next one is enable SP initiated SSO. So if you want the service provider initiated SSO, then you can go ahead and enable it. So this means that if we hit on the entity 360 or supplier 360 or customer C360 URL and you want us to send the request to IDP and get the SAML response back, then we can check this. And then you'll be prompted to select which application you want to enable SP initiated SSO for. You can either select all of them if you're using all of these applications and you want single sign-on for them, or you can just go with one or two of them depending on your requirement. So if you see here, you will be asked to enter the IDP URL, which is basically the identity provider URL, which is also called the redirect URL. So for me, I'm filling it up, and then also the receiving URL of the SAML response. You can go ahead and fill it up, and for now I'll just enable it for entity 360. So the point that we need to remember here is that IDP can be same for like all of the applications that you're selecting, even if you're selecting more than one. But then the only thing is that you need to send a proper SAML request to them. So if you're not sending a proper SAML request, then the IDP cannot be same, right? So let's move on to the next one, which is need to send SAML request. So if you need to send a SAML request, then you can enable it, and then you will be seeing this box on the right hand side with these parameters. So the first one is the authentication type. There are various selections from which you can choose, and this is something that is totally coming from the SSO team. It's nothing to do from the MDM side of the implementation. So based on their authentication type that they're following for their organization, we can choose it. Next one is the name ID request format. We have a couple of selections here as well. So it's basically the format that you're expecting in the SAML request. Again, on the MDM side, we do not have any choice. It's up to the SSO team to decide on this and let us know. In return, we just want the username to be populated, as that is how we'll be checking for the users in the MDM Hub database. So that is all we need. But then we can go ahead and choose anything that the SAML SSO team wants us to. Next part is URL encode SAML request. So if you want the SAML request to be URL encoded, then we can go ahead and enable this. So if you need a signature in the SAML request, then we can enable this parameter. So we need to give the private key and the certificate through which we can sign the SAML request before sending it to IDP. So this is where you can put them in. For now, I'm just disabling it because we're not using it for this configuration. So these are all the parameters, and this was a quick overview of all of them and how we can choose different parameters based on our requirements. So once we have filled up all the parameters, the next step is to just go ahead and click on publish. So before that, let me just change the name ID request format to email address, and I will go ahead and just review all the other parameters and publish. Now once you hit on publish, you can see a pop-up like this which says SSO or the custom login module enabled successfully. Please restart the server. So at this point we can go ahead and restart the server. Now while I do that, so if you see this, like there's a little bit of change in the UI page. So if you see, the publish button has now been changed to update button. That means we also have an option to update the SSO configuration. One thing to keep in mind regarding updating the configuration is that there are few fields that we cannot update. We need to roll back the config and only then update these parameters. If you see, some of the parameters are disabled, and that's how you know that in order to edit them, you need to roll back. So anything that has to do with the file import, we need to roll back. Now let's go ahead and hit the SSO URL since it's configured. Let's see how it's working end to end. So let me go ahead and put in the username and the password. And I'll also open the SAML tracer, which is like a tool that we can use to kind of track the requests and the response. So let's log in, and you should be redirected and you should be logged in into the E360 page. Now, based on the role that you're assigned on the MDM Hub, you can go ahead and perform all the operations like you usually do on E360 UI. So let me log out, and we are taken to google.com. That's because in our configuration, we have given the logout URL as google.com, and so that was expected behavior. Now let's take a look at the SAML response that's captured. If we take a look at this, we'll see that in the SAML response, the response is encrypted, as you can see. It's because we have enabled the SAML response needs to be encrypted parameter here, and we have provided the private key location. So just you can use the SAML tracer to do quick checks like that. Now on the folder side, let's see how to validate if the configuration is done properly. So we have to go to the hub server temp IDD, and there is a login provider, and there is a custom login provider within the login provider, and this is where all the jars will be deployed. These are all the supporting jars. Now one more check is on the hub side, so we need to log in into the hub and let's connect to the master database. So under configuration workbench, if we go to security providers, we can see that there's a custom login module that got deployed here. So this is the custom login SAML jar that got deployed under the authentication providers, and also under the user profile providers we are able to see the jar. So these two are the quick checks that we can make once we configure SSO to see if everything went through well. Now let's take a look at the folder structure of this SAML SSO. Now let's begin with the jar file. So there is a orig folder which has the custom login SAML jar. So that is the original jar file, which you'll be able to see here as well. But once you make the configuration, this custom login SAML jar will be updated. If you see, there's an increase in its size. So each time you roll back again, the original file will be back. Now coming to the logs, there is this custom login config log that gets printed. If you see, it has all the messages. So as soon as you hit the URL, so as soon as you hit the SSO URL in the browser, you will be able to see that this log gets printed. So the extract login credentials, and then it's going to the IDP URL that it'll go ahead and check for the SAML request if there's one present, and once the authentication is successful, it will go ahead and log the user in successfully. So these are the logs you can check, and apart from this, there's also a log within the JBoss folder, which is the utility log. So any changes that you make on the UI will be captured in this MDM CustomLoginConfig app. So if you go ahead and see, there is the rollback and update and those steps that you take on the UI that will be logged in here. So this is specifically for JBoss because, as I mentioned, there is a bug in JBoss and these cannot be printed in the server log, but for the other app servers, these log messages will be printed in the system out log itself. Let's go back and see what are the other folders present within SAML SSO. The next one is the metadata folder. So if you make any configuration changes on the UI side, then there is a JSON that will get created here. So every time you make changes, there is a JSON backup that will get created. So you know like what is the last configuration that you made before you roll back. So this is how it looks like. It's basically just a representation of all those parameters that you have configured in a JSON format. The next folder is the property folder, within which there is a SSO properties file, which has all the parameters and what values you have set up for them. Now this SSO properties file is also a part of the custom login SAML jar. If I go ahead and show you, there is a SAML SSO properties file here. Now if you see this, it's pretty much the same configuration now between these two SSO properties file, but the difference comes when you update any configuration on the UI, then the SSO properties file within the property folder, that's where it will get updated. If you see, it gets updated here, and then this file takes precedence over the SSO properties file present in the custom login SAML jar. So this is only for updates. The next three folders are if you need a SAML signature and a SAML request, and you have to use a certificate and a private key. Then in the previous versions, we had to keep the files on the servers and then give the path of that. But in this version, that's not needed. You can just upload the certificate and the private key from your local laptop, and the files will get saved here. So now the next folder is response. This is just a sample encrypted response. Next one is the temp folder. It is basically the system folder. And then we have the test folder, which is for testing purposes. And we also have a XML folder, which has some sample request templates. There's also this conf folder, which is used for logging. So if you just want to disable the logs, then you can just set it to false, and the custom login config log will no longer be printed. And the max size, you can set it here. So if you don't want your day-to-day logins to be printed, you can just disable them here. Alright, so we have reached the end of our presentation. I hope you all followed along and have a good knowledge on the MDM CustomLoginConfig App version 3. For those of you all who are thinking of implementing single sign-on, please also refer to the KB article that's mentioned here. Please reach out to us on supportvideos@informatica.com, and you can also reach out to us on Twitter and let us know your comments. Thank you and have a great day.